All right, everyone. I have talked about the biblical notion of law, or the reality of salvation, talked about the four types of law. And now, what I'd like to discuss is some reasoning when it comes to laws that we follow, laws that we don't, and understanding and navigating why certain laws change in the church and why certain laws remain the same. So we're dealing with both an ethical framework and we're dealing with the desire to, of course, create an ordered and civilized society. Now, for Catholics, we don't really distinguish between ethics and politics. Their politics comes out of ethics because we're dealing with human relationships. We're dealing with rightly ordering them. And so when it comes to creating laws in society to make it function and work, we have to maintain them to be reasonable. So one of the things that we attempt to do is distinguish between primary laws and secondary laws, or principles and secondary principles. So principles are kind of like a starter, if you will. It's where we start with something. It's a given, okay? And one of them would be the right to life, okay? And so we have the right to life because we have human dignity. And from that comes all sorts of secondary rights, such as the right to access food, water, um, employment, and so on. So when we have the right to life, it means that we have the right to those things which therefore subsequently give us that ability to thrive and be alive. And so we have to create a society which gives people access to these things. Now we can't of course force people all day to drink water or to take care of themselves, but we do have to provide them the means to accomplish that. We can't find a creative way of starving people that we don't like, for example. Another law that could come forth from the right to life would be speed limits. So we have all sorts of speed limits that enable safe driving that protects life. So one law that will never change is that principle that you have human dignity, and that you have the right to preserve that life. But then coming from that, sometimes other issues come into play. So for example, if the basis of speed limits was to protect life, and all of a sudden there's a tornado behind you while you're driving on Highway 40, uh, the law suspends that secondary principle in favor of this circumstance that we're now in. And so it's built off of the logic or the spirit, if you will, of preserving life, right? And so there are certain laws that would be suspended that you wouldn't be tried for quote unquote breaking. And that's an important distinction that we would make when talking about laws. Now, it gets very interesting and complicated when we begin talking about suspending certain human laws or even natural laws in favor of the divine law. So, when Jesus, for example, was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was sweating blood because he had so much anxiety, if you will, or suffering, as a result of surrendering to giving up his life, we have to keep in mind that it is a natural law that we try to preserve our own lives. That is a good thing that God has given us. But in this situation, God was calling him to something higher. And so the higher the calling, the more fundamental or more principle that law is. So when it comes from God, we might suspend certain natural laws. And we have to be very careful with how we nuance that and explain it. But all of a sudden, martyrdom becomes a way in the life of the church. It becomes the higher calling in which we are to seek to be free one day, to be able to lay our life down for Jesus just as he laid it down for us. And so this doesn't mean we're going against our nature. It just means that we're suspending that principle within us for a deeper principle, which is that we were created to be faithful to God, to love him, and to love one another. And that goes even deeper. So these are some concepts around law, and this is why we kind of have different laws in church law. So there's this thing called canon law. And canon law really is comprised of all sorts of different types of law. So it would be an element of human law for the church, and that element can just constantly change. And so we call that merely ecclesial law. The church specifically uses the word merely to describe that because these are things that can change. And they're there to serve the higher purposes of the church. So when they start to get in the way of people practicing their faith, when they become a burden, they're dispensed or they're changed. Okay. And that often happens because the culture changes, the world changes, the needs as a result change. That's a very important thing for us to consider is that culture is a fluid reality. It changes, okay? And so there's a certain adaptability and pivoting that has to exist within the law. We even see that with the Jewish people as they were traveling through the desert. They didn't have a temple, they didn't have all sorts of resources, and so there were all sorts of vulnerabilities that they had. They had to be harsher with some punishments in order to preserve the tribe as they were traveling through the desert for 40 years. And so once they did situate themselves in a different environment, some of those laws changed. And then when Christ came, some of the laws changed because the previous laws were there to prefigure Christ, and now they were fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and we no longer needed prefigurements because we have the real thing, Jesus himself. And so what we see in all of this is there's a lot to nuance, a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, which is why it gets frustrating for Christians, especially when maybe an atheist apologist comes in and says, "Well, you're being inconsistent. You're following this law, but not that law." Well, there's a lot of intelligence that's going into deciphering which laws we follow and which ones we don't, and it isn't based on some arbitrary whim within our culture. It's based on reason. It's based on revelation. It's based on good thinking and discernment. So the key here is to understand that with law, we aren't fundamentalists. Not every law is meant to be considered in an absolute way. Like this is always wrong all the time. So this leads me to making a distinction between positive precepts and negative ones. So St. Thomas Aquinas, when he's talking about these two types of laws or precepts, what he says is that, generally speaking, a positive precept is something that is good to do, but not always. So again, he's saying, it might be good to evangelize, but you do have to go to bed every once in a while, right? And so you're not going to evangelize to the point of killing yourself, and to not sleep, if you will, when you're being called to sleep. And so positive precepts are good, but they have to match the circumstance in which you're called to. In some cases, maybe preaching is a good abstractly, but not for this person. Maybe that's not a gift that they have been given, a charism of the Holy Spirit. Maybe their charism is somewhere else. And so we have to discern the body. We have to discern the gifts of the Spirit that have been poured out upon us. So that's what a positive precept is. It's something that's good, but not in every circumstance. So it has to be discerned. Now, a negative precept is, generally speaking, always wrong. So, when we're talking about the Ten Commandments, for example, it's always wrong to kill an innocent person. That is the interpretation of that law against killing. Um, it is always wrong to take something that is not yours, to steal. Many times people will justify and say, well, it is owed to me. And if that's not true, then it's still stealing. And so all of a sudden we have these laws, these ordinance of reasons they're always wrong, always. And so there's no exception. And we call those things as a Catholic Church intrinsically evil. So they're evil in it of themselves. They're always wrong in it of themselves. So that you run into people who are always looking for exceptions. Um, and I think that's just part of like the way sin runs in our mind. We're always looking for a way out of this one rule, and we'll come up with all these scenarios that are maybe appealing to emotions and maybe really complicated. But the church has these three ways of discerning right from wrong that I find very helpful. So, in order to judge whether this act is intrinsically evil or the act is bad in general, we have to look at three things, and Catechism mentions them. And this comes from Aristotle, a very smart cookie, okay? And he says that we have to judge the intention, the object or the means, and the end. So those are the three things. Now, they all have to work in a harmony together for the act to be good. So I'll give you an example. So let's say I want to feed the poor, but I need money. So my intention is I'm going to get some money. And it's not wrong to want to get money. And now my the second act I'm going to do is I'm going to buy food and give it to the poor. But what I do is I choose to rob a bank. Okay, so the circumstance would be I go to the bank at night because I don't want anyone to be harmed, but I'm stealing the money and I'm giving it to the poor. Well, that's other people's money, right? And so that's wrong. That money doesn't belong to me. It's not up to me to discern what to do with other people's life savings. In fact, I may be making people poor as I'm trying to feed the poor in the process. It's not very good logic. So part of the problem here is this Robin Hood mentality is the ends justifies the means. And so this is where we fall into an error called utilitarianism. So just because I have a good intention doesn't mean the act is good. And this is why many people have said in the church's history, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Okay, so it's not just our intention. The second thing that we have to discern is um, the intention. It is important to have a good intention. I could be feeding the poor, let's say at a soup kitchen, while taking selfies with them, uh, because I want to post on social media and virtue signal. And that's really wrong because I'm using someone's poverty, someone's unfortunate circumstances to serve myself, which means I don't actually care about them. I care more about being perceived as caring about them. And if they catch on to that, that's a that's starving them of something even deeper, which is dignity and charity. Okay. And so our intention has to be good. And this is where the law has to be written on our heart. We have to be doing these acts, fulfill these means in the right for the right purposes, the right spirit. And finally, circumstances. So circumstances a little more complicated when talking about, if an act is good or bad. Because generally speaking, circumstances, what they do is they either increase the evil of an act or decrease it, or increase the goodness of an act or decrease it. So, for example, if I'm, uh, feeding the poor out on the street, it may not be as good of an environment to do it then as a soup kitchen. So it's still good that I'm doing it, but I need to find a better circumstance to do this so that I have more resources, it's more organized, maybe more hygienic and following code. Okay. So then in some cases though, St. Thomas makes this point though, in some cases the circumstances can define whether the act is good or bad. And so, for example, if I'm skipping rope, for the purpose of exercising, that sounds great. But if I'm doing it on top of the altar during a funeral, or just on top of the altar, that's sacrilegious, right? That's very disrespectful to the sacredness of that place. And so then the object becomes sacrilege. And so here's the key is that circumstances generally change the quality of whether the act was good or bad, the degree to which it was good or bad. But sometimes they can actually make the action evil. Now you'll notice that in law, when you have to put someone in jail, there's basically two things that I've just mentioned out of these three that you have to have. You have to have mens rea and actus reus, right? The act, mens rea is the intention. Now, we often have circumstantial evidence around that as well, but all three of those things have to go together. Now, even within circumstances, there are laws about what you can do in this space and what you can't do in that space. And so even that is built into the law itself. And so these are things that the church really developed and blessed Western civilization with, and are meant to be part of our daily discernment. And so I hope that helps you as we finalize and reflect on the law and all the thinking and nuancing that really go into it. There's a million more things I could say about that, but if you're interested, come to join us at Catholic Wisdom, where we talk even more deeply about these matters. God bless you.